I've just spent 4 days in Oxford sketching with friends who I met through urban sketching. I came home with 14 finished sketches, another 2 or 3 unfinished ones, thanks to the wonderful British summertime, and a few new art supplies that I didn't need, thanks to my hotel being a few feet away from an art shop. In this video, I'll share some of the sketches from the trip, explain why I found myself returning to a paint-first approach, and try out some new materials along the way. But what made this trip special wasn't really the sketches at all. Shh. As you can see, my hotel is really central, which is very handy, and there's just so much to sketch here in Oxford. The reason for the trip was a little reunion with some of the people I'd met on Stephanie Bauer's workshops here in Oxford over the last few years. We've all kept in touch, and between us travelled from New York, Madrid, Frankfurt, London, and Oxfordshire Village, and, well, me from Suffolk. It's funny how such good friendships can form when you share a passion for something, like sitting on uncomfortable stools in the rain drawing random buildings while passers-by look at you a bit oddly. But it was so good to see everyone again, and the week started off bright and sunny. We spent the first morning sketching some of the buildings around my friend's hotel. For the first sketch, I decided to use a paint-first approach, and it's an approach you'll see recurring through this trip. In fact, I found myself returning to it again and again for a number of different reasons, which I'll explain as we go through the video. One of the only downsides to this approach is you do have to wait for the paint to dry, so while I waited for that, I turned to the opposite page and sketched the opposite view using my usual ink-first approach. The next stop was the Radcliffe Camera, somewhere we've all sketched before on Stephanie's workshops. I've gone for a paint-first approach again here because I think it really comes into its own in two situations: when you're short of time or when the subject itself is quite complicated, which I think circular buildings can be. Stephanie had shared some really useful ways of thinking about perspective on curved buildings, and my sketches from those workshops were undoubtedly much more accurate, both proportionally and perspectively, but they also took considerably longer. Here, I wasn't aiming for that same level of precision, I was just trying to capture the character of the building before my coffee went cold. And I used the same technique here on another circular building, the Sheldonian Theatre. I did this sketch one morning after breakfast when I had a short period before I was meeting up with friends again. Not knowing exactly how long I had, I decided that a loose paint-first approach would not only keep the time down, but might also help me tackle those awkward curves. That said, those lessons from Stephanie were absolutely still there in the back of my mind, and clearly helped even when I was simplifying it. Here, as you can see, I've already been shopping in the art shop, and I'm using my newly acquired Blackwing pencil to add some detail on top of the watercolour. I'd really like to have sketched some of these characterful heads that circle the Sheldonian in more detail, but unfortunately I just couldn't get close enough to get a proper look at them. They're an iconic feature of Oxford, and there's quite a lot of mystery surrounding them too, so if you're interested in finding out more, they're known as the heritage heads if you want to Google them. Little did I know I'd be spending quite a bit of time in this spot throughout the coming days, which also meant I'd be spending quite a bit of money in the library cafe. We were determined not to be those people who occupied tables for hours while buying only a single coffee and a tap water. The weather couldn't quite make its mind up. One minute it was chucking it down or blowing a chilly breeze, the next the sun was out and it was absolutely baking hot, which is why this sheltered spot outside the library proved so useful. But the downside was, obviously, that every time I found myself taking refuge here, I was faced with more or less the same view. And as you'll see, that led to rather more sketches of the Sheldonian Theatre and surrounding buildings than I'd originally planned. We weren't the only people taking advantage of the shelter here either. This gentleman was also sketching away from exactly the same spot, and it wasn't even raining. On another occasion, when we were yet again sheltering from the British summer, I sketched the Sheldonian again, this time using my more usual ink-first approach. But actually, I think on this occasion I prefer the paint-first version. The ink-first sketch has gone a little bit awry, and I seem to have somehow created the Leaning Tower of Oxford. Another spot that proved useful when the weather turned was the Natural History Museum. But not wanting to use wet media indoors, I decided to use coloured pencils instead. I'd packed a few for this trip, but bought a few more supplies on a visit to the art shop. including some more coloured pencils and some pans to fill my new Roman Schmal tin that I received for my birthday earlier this month. Not every sketch in Oxford has to be one of the famous landmarks, though. I think I've ended up in that pink pub on the corner with fellow sketchers at least once every trip I've made to the city. But what attracted me to this scene wasn't the pub, it was the bikes. I find bikes are one of those really tricky things to draw, and rather than thinking of them as bicycles, I tried to think of them as just a jumble of wheels, handlebars and bits of twisted metal. But I did try to pay attention to the level of detail, and those furthest away, for example, you can't see individual spokes, but as they get closer, we can see more detail. And that's often a useful way to create a sense of depth. One of the highlights of the trip was catching up with my friend Esther from New York. She lives near the factory where these sketch and wash pencils are made, and very kindly gave me one to try. I decided to use it when I sat with Esther to sketch the Bridge of Sighs, or Hertford Bridge as it's officially named. I started off just by doing a normal pencil drawing. I wish I'd had a better sharpener with me. In fact, I'm still trying to find a really good portable pencil sharpener, so if anyone has any suggestions, please do leave them in the comments. And then once I'd finished the line work, I activated it with a water brush to create shadows, hence it's called Sketch and Wash. And I really like the effect that it gave.
See, it's like this is wonderful, this kind of effect, the
Lovely, isn't
sharpness
it?
and that softness.
We got a little bit chilly because we were sitting in the shade. We'd started off on the other side of the road in the sun, but this is quite a popular spot, as you'd imagine, for tour guides, and one of them quite pointedly told her flock to stay on the pavement, and I think it was aimed at us that we were in her way, sitting on the pavement. So obviously we didn't want to be in anyone's way, so we picked up our stools and moved to the other side of the road. As well as bicycles, another thing that I find tricky to draw are columns. For me, they're a bit of a chicken and egg problem. I need to draw them first because they're in front of everything else, but I like to know what's behind them because I need to know how long to make them, so it's quite the conundrum. So once again, I found a paint first approach seemed to make things a little bit easier. Having bought a nice big A4 sketchbook from the art shop, I sketched the Oxford Martin School because, like Mount Everest, it was there. From my chair, under the shelter of the library once more, because it was raining again. By this point, I was starting to run out of new views from my favourite sheltered spot, so I shuffled my chair yet another few degrees and tackled the corner of Broad Street. Not the most exciting subject, but hey, I'm not drawing that flipping Sheldonian Theatre again. Ever. All too soon, it was my last day. I attempted another sketch from the far end of Broad Street, dangerously close to the art shop that I was trying to resist visiting again. And it started raining again. I'd even fanned out some rough pencil guidelines to aid with the perspective. If you want to know how I use them to help, I'll link a video at the top of the screen. I could have finished it from the photograph I took, but I know I never will. So I simply just splashed on a little colour when I was out of the rain. The sun eventually came out for one last final hurrah. So we sat and did one last sketch of a wine bar before heading home. The weather wasn't perfect, I didn't film very much, but I came home with a sketchbook full of memories. Memories of spending time with friends, sharing sketchbooks and materials over coffee, lots of coffee thanks to the Western Library Cafe, comparing approaches and techniques, and catching up with people I might never have met if I hadn't started urban sketching. And that's the most special thing about the trip. I just love how that shared interest brought us all together from different countries and different backgrounds, and we're already tentatively planning where the next adventure might be. Thanks very much for watching, and happy sketching.